Having talked about constitutional rights and in general the connection between human rights law on the one hand and constitutional law on the other hand, it is important to also consider the role of legislation and the role that legislative measures play in the realization of human rights. And often, in fact, they are not given the attention that they deserve because legal scholars, lawyers are focused on courts, they are focused on the sort of judicial protection that is provided most notably through constitutional rights and rights laid down in various constitutional documents, and forget that in fact legislation plays an absolutely key role when it comes to human rights implementation. So what then specifically is the relevance of legislative measures when it comes to this protection of human rights? This was the question that I posed to you. And the first thing to consider here is, of course, the one that is also being discussed in the textbook, which is that in many states you in fact have, in a way, normal, or as the textbook calls them, ordinary pieces of legislation that, other than for that status, are very much comparable to, for instance, the individual rights catalog that you would find in a constitution or in a human rights instrument. Now, the book goes on to explain that these are quasi-constitutional documents, and I can see why this language is used. I do think it's a little bit confusing because if you, for example, consider how the UK system, constitutional system, is made up, you will know that in the UK, Parliament is the highest sovereign. So the principle of parliamentary sovereignty means that there's nothing higher than an act of Parliament, and there can not ever be anything higher than an act of Parliament except for another act of Parliament. So in this case, in fact, a human rights bill such as the 1998 Human Rights Act is very much a constitutional document. It is the highest document that you can provide and the highest kind of judicial protection that you can provide in the UK domestic system. And Adam Wagner also in the podcast episode points to the same thing, namely that the Human Rights Act is very much a part of the UK constitutional framework. And in a way, it's a little bit of an academic discussion on whether it is or not, or how we should exactly call it, because in practice, it does provide the kind of judicial protection that is necessary in order for human rights to be available in practice to people on the jurisdiction of the state. But aside from representing constitutional guarantees in some specific settings, such as in the UK constitutional system, there are also other functions that legislative measures play and where they become very, very useful. And I want to mention three specific ones here, starting with the fact that legislation and the legislator, for that matter, are absolutely crucial in order to mainstream human rights. What is meant by mainstreaming? Well, it's of course nice and important to have judicial protection of rights, to be able to invoke human rights in a court. Much of what we talk about in this course is about that. But it is also really important for Parliament to make sure that in each and every piece of legislation, that in each and every amendment that is being proposed, human rights are in fact taken into account and there is a human rights compatibility from the outset. Think, for example, about a labor law that would introduce a minimum wage. You will have to make sure that this is in line with all non-discrimination guarantees. So equal pay, for instance, by default should be a part of this. Not just that, the legislator will have to think in detail, and this brings me to the second point, what could go wrong and how could we in fact in detail achieve the kind of objectives that have been put down in human rights instruments. Here, think for example of the right to education. Very important, obviously laid down in various treaties such as the ICESCR, very likely put down also in a constitution, Now, in order to make sure that the right to education is effectively provided for, you will have to implement a range of things, from actually the schools to education for teachers, to ensuring the quality, to ensuring that there is equal access of all students, to the fact that also persons with disabilities receive the reasonable accommodation that they deserve. All of these many intricate and important aspects are needing to be taken into account by the legislator, as the legislator creates and sustains and continuously improves the educational system that exists in a state. And obviously, the educational branch is often a massive sector with thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or more employees. And finally, and this actually also draws on the point I just made, we have this whole notion that we talked about a few weeks back of progressive realization of economic and social rights. And obviously, it's the legislator who is expected to make sure that rights are being progressively realized. So, staying with the right to education, if resources are missing at the outset, so to stay with the example of the right to education, if resources are missing at the outset for more than just basic education, as a state develops, as more resources become available, it will be the task of Parliament, of the legislator, to ensure that, well, the right to education is being provided for at higher levels depending on the resources that have become available and the capacities of the state. Again, very important that we have courts to oversee this process, but the actor, the initiator, that's at least the general understanding, is the legislator who needs to make sure that these rights are being provided for. So in short, the legislator and legislation play absolutely key roles in the implementation, domestication of human rights law, not just because in some legal systems they actually act as the constitutional guarantees, but also because they mainstream, monitor, implement, also in highly technical details, the rights that are being put down on a relatively abstract level and in broad terms in human rights instruments, or for that matter, in constitutions. This concludes the second video. I'll now move on to the topic of domestic courts and the role they play in human rights protection.